In the mathematics of desperation, there exists a threshold beyond which hope becomes not merely impractical, but irrational. A point where the mind, in its infinite capacity for self-preservation, simply stops calculating outcomes and accepts the inevitable. The Xolari ascendancy had reached that threshold 17 days before I found myself standing in a communications chamber that had fallen silent for the first time in 12,000 years, watching the last transmission of our distress beacon fade into the uncaring void between stars. I am Valeth Sorn, third voice of the outer reaches, and I had spent 4 centuries serving as a diplomatic liaison to species that my civilization considered beneath serious consideration. It was a position of quiet exile, given to those whose thinking had drifted too far from acceptable parameters, those who asked uncomfortable questions about the assumptions upon which our 12,000-year supremacy had been built. I had questioned once whether our dismissal of younger species might eventually prove short-sighted. That single moment of heresy had earned me a posting to the edge of known space, where I could do no harm to the comfortable certainties of those who had never learned to doubt. Now, as our civilization crumbled under the weight of an enemy we had never anticipated, I found myself thinking that perhaps my heresy had not gone far enough.
The Vethkai had come from the spaces between galaxies, entities of pure consumption that existed only to feed upon the energy of living worlds. They had no culture, no communication, no motivation that we could understand. They simply arrived, consumed, and moved on, leaving dead systems in their wake like the discarded husks of fruit stripped of all nourishment. For 12,000 years, the Xolari ascendancy had been the dominant power in our region of the galaxy. We had developed technologies that younger species could barely comprehend. We had built fleets that darkened the stars when they moved. We had established trade networks and diplomatic protocols and systems of governance that had brought order to 100,000 worlds.
The Vethkai had dismantled all of it in less than a year. Our fleets, those magnificent armadas that had never known defeat, had been consumed like kindling thrown into a furnace. Our worlds, those ancient centers of culture and learning, had been stripped of life with a thoroughness that left not even bacteria surviving. Our people, trillions of minds representing millennia of accumulated knowledge, had simply ended. And throughout it all, we had sent distress beacons into the void, calling for help from anyone who might hear. We had contacted every species we had ever traded with, every civilization we had ever encountered, every government that had ever sought our wisdom or feared our power. One by one, they had refused. Some cited the danger. The Vethkai were too powerful, too incomprehensible, too certain to consume any force sent against them. Others cited ancient grievances. The Xolari had not always been gentle in our dealings with younger species, and there were many who remembered our condescension with bitter clarity. Still others simply did not respond at all, their silence speaking more eloquently than any refusal. We had expected no answer. We had made too many enemies over too many millennia, had dismissed too many pleas from species we considered beneath us, had turned away too many times when others had needed our help.
The universe, it seemed, had a long memory.
"The beacon has completed its final cycle," the communications officer reported, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had already accepted death. "All power reserves are depleted. We will have no further capacity for long-range transmission." I nodded, watching the indicator lights fade one by one.
Around me, the chamber that had once buzzed with the constant activity of a galaxy-spanning civilization had fallen into an exhausted silence. The few remaining staff moved like ghosts, going through the motions of duty without any expectation that their efforts would matter.
We had 4 days until the Vethkai reached our final stronghold, the station designated Kethar's Light, the last functioning outpost of a civilization that had once believed itself eternal. 47,000 survivors huddled within its walls, the remnants of trillions waiting for an end that had become as certain as the movement of stars.
I was turning to leave the chamber when the sensor officer made a sound, not words but a strangled exclamation that drew every eye in the room.
"Voice Veleth Sorn," she said, her voice trembling with something I could not immediately identify. "You need to see this."
I moved to her station, expecting to see the Vethkai advancing ahead of schedule, expecting to learn that our final hours had been reduced to minutes.
Instead, I saw ships. Not Vethkai, not Kethari. Ships of a configuration I had never seen, angular, practical, without the elegant curves that most spacefaring civilizations favored. They were emerging from transit points in numbers that my mind struggled to process. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. "What are they?" someone asked.
I studied the sensor readings, searching for any identifier that would explain what I was seeing. The ships bore no markings I recognized, flew in no formation I had encountered, and broadcast no signals on any frequency we monitored.
Then the first transmission came through, and everything I thought I understood about the galaxy shifted beneath my feet. "Kethari Station. This is Admiral Marcus Chen of the United Earth Defense Coalition. We received your distress beacon and are responding in force. Please advise on current Vethkai positions and any surviving civilian populations requiring evacuation. Humanity stands ready to assist." Humanity. The words struck me like a physical blow. Humanity. The species that the Kethari had dismissed as barely worth cataloging. Humanity, the civilization that our assessors had evaluated as technologically primitive and strategically irrelevant less than 2 centuries ago. Humanity, the young, struggling species that had been denied membership in every major galactic organization because they had nothing to offer. They had come. When every ancient power in the galaxy had refused, when every species with the capability to help had turned away, humanity had answered. "How many ships?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The sensor officer's hands trembled as she worked her console. 12,000 confirmed transits so far, more arriving every minute. Voice Veleth Sorn at this rate. She paused, rechecked her readings, and looked up at me with an expression of pure disbelief. "At this rate, they will outnumber the Vethkai by a factor of 3 within the hour." I stared at the display, watching the small icons multiply like stars being born in rapid succession. 12,000 ships, more arriving constantly, a force that dwarfed any fleet the Kethari had ever assembled, appearing from a species we had never considered a military power. "Open a channel," I ordered. "I will respond personally." The communication officer hesitated. "Voice, should we not consult the High Council before—" "The High Council is dead," I reminded her, the words carrying a weight that seemed to press against my chest. "They died on Kethar Prime 3 weeks ago. I am the highest-ranking diplomatic official remaining. Open the channel." She complied, and suddenly I found myself facing a holographic projection of a human male, older, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of difficult decisions.
He wore a uniform that was simple almost to the point of austerity, devoid of the elaborate decorations that most military leaders favored.
Voice Veleth Sorn, Admiral Chen said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed incongruous with the circumstances. I'm glad we reached you in time. We've been monitoring your beacon since it first began transmitting. I apologize for the delay in our response. Mobilizing a force of this size requires considerable coordination. I found myself struggling for words, something that had never happened in 4 centuries of diplomatic service. Admiral, I must confess that I do not understand. Humanity has never been an ally of the Cathari ascendancy. We have never provided you with aid or even acknowledged your requests for formal diplomatic recognition. Your species has no obligation to us, no treaty requiring mutual defense, no reason whatsoever to involve yourselves in our destruction. Admiral Chen was quiet for a moment, his expression shifting to something I could not quite read. Voice Veleth Sorn, may I ask you a question?
Of course.
When your beacon began transmitting, did you expect anyone to answer?
The question caught me off guard. I considered dissembling, offering the sort of diplomatic non-answer that I had perfected over centuries of service. But something about this human, something about the direct simplicity of his gaze, made evasion feel not just futile, but somehow shameful.
No, I admitted. We expected no answer. We had made too many enemies over the millennia, dismissed too many calls for help from others. We sent the beacon because protocol demanded it, not because we believed anyone would come. Admiral Chen nodded slowly. That's what we thought. When we detected your beacon, our intelligence analysts provided a detailed report on every species with the capability to respond. They also provided assessments of why each species would choose not to. He paused. It was a very long list of grievances.
And yet you came anyway.
Why? The Admiral's expression shifted again, something that might have been sadness or perhaps memory. Because, Voice Veleth Sorn, humanity has been in your position, not facing the Vethkai specifically, but facing extinction, facing the certainty of ending. We have sent our own desperate calls into the void and received only silence in return. He leaned forward slightly. We know what it feels like to expect no answer. And we decided as a species that we would never be the ones who failed to respond when someone else made that same desperate call.
I felt something shift in my understanding, a tectonic reordering of assumptions I had held for centuries. But the resources, the risk to your own people,
are considerable, Admiral Chen agreed. We are not blind to the danger the Vethkai represent. We are not naive enough to believe this will be easy or bloodless. We expect to lose ships. We expect to lose lives. His voice hardened almost imperceptibly. But we did not build this fleet to keep it safe. We built it so that when the moment came, when someone needed help that no one else would provide, we could answer.
Admiral, I do not know how to respond to this. You don't need to respond, Voice. You need to provide us with tactical data. Where are your surviving populations? What defensive capabilities do you have remaining? What do we need to know about the Vethkai that might not be in our intelligence files? He smiled, a simple expression that somehow carried more warmth than any diplomatic gesture I had ever received. There will be time for gratitude later. Right now, we have work to do. The hours that followed became a blur of activity that stood in stark contrast to the paralyzed waiting of the previous weeks. Human coordination officers arrived at Kethar's Light via rapid shuttle, their efficiency almost unsettling in its precision. They did not waste time on ceremony or protocol. They assessed our situation, integrated our remaining defensive systems into their command structure, and began organizing evacuation procedures for our civilian population.
I found myself assigned as liaison to the human command ship, a vessel called the Prometheus that served as Admiral Chen's flagship. It was not what I expected. The Cathari ascendancy had built our vessels to reflect our status: sweeping lines, elegant proportions, decorative elements that proclaimed our cultural sophistication. The Prometheus was a weapon that happened to contain living spaces. Every surface was designed for function. Every system was optimized for combat effectiveness. There was no art on the walls, no attempt at aesthetic beauty, only readouts, displays, and the constant hum of systems maintained at peak efficiency. And yet, as I walked its corridors, I began to notice something else. The crew wore personal items, small tokens attached to uniforms or displayed at workstations, photographs of families, religious symbols, handwritten notes tucked into pockets, a child's drawing pinned above a tactical console. These were not soldiers who had abandoned their humanity to become pure instruments of war. These were individuals who had chosen to face death while carrying everything they loved with them.
Voice Veleth Sorn. A young human female approached me, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okafor, according to the name badge on her uniform. Admiral Chen asked me to provide you with a briefing on our engagement strategy. Do you have a moment?
Of course. She led me to a tactical center, where holographic displays showed the disposition of forces across the system. The human fleet had arranged itself in a complex formation that I did not recognize, multiple layers of vessels with smaller ships positioned in patterns that seemed almost random.
We've studied the Vethkai engagement patterns extensively, Lieutenant Commander Okafor explained. Your own tactical records were quite detailed. Thank you for sharing them, by the way. We noticed that the Vethkai respond to threats in a predictable manner. They concentrate force against the largest energy signatures and consume those targets before moving to secondary objectives.
Yes, I confirmed. This is why our fleets were so vulnerable. Our capital ships drew their attention and, once engaged, could not withdraw before being consumed.
Exactly, so we've designed our engagement strategy around that pattern. She gestured at the display. We're not going to fight them with capital ships, we're going to fight them with coordination. She began explaining a strategy of such complexity that it took me several minutes to grasp its outlines. The human fleet was organized into thousands of small squadrons, each capable of independent operation but linked through a communication network that allowed for instantaneous coordination. Rather than presenting large targets for the Vethkai to consume, they would present thousands of small targets that would constantly shift position, attacking from unexpected angles and withdrawing before the Vethkai could concentrate force against them.
It's a strategy we developed from studying something in our own history, Lieutenant Commander Okafor said. Small groups of coordinated fighters defeating larger, more powerful opponents through mobility and communication. We call it swarm tactics, though the actual implementation is considerably more sophisticated.
This level of coordination, I struggled to find the right words. How is it possible? The timing required, the precision of movement. It would require each commander to anticipate the actions of thousands of others.
Yes, she agreed simply. It would, and it does. She met my gaze with an expression of quiet confidence. Voice Veleth, humanity has been fighting wars against ourselves for our entire history. We have had to develop strategies that allow small groups to defeat larger forces, that allow coordination without centralized command, that allow rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. It's not something we're proud of,
but it is something we've become very good at. You speak of your history of conflict as though it were a weakness. Because it was. Every war we fought was a failure of diplomacy, of understanding, of our ability to find peaceful solutions. We killed millions of our own kind over resources, over ideology, over things that seem unforgivably petty in retrospect. She paused. But we also learned. Every conflict taught us something about survival, about strategy, about the importance of standing together when faced with genuine threats. We emerged from our history of war with a determination that we would never again fight each other, and with the skills to face anything that threatened us from outside. You turned your greatest failure into your greatest strength. We tried to. We're still trying. She smiled, and there was something in that expression that I was beginning to recognize as distinctly human, a blend of hope and determination that refused to accept defeat even when facing overwhelming odds. The Vethkai are terrifying, Voice. We understand that, but they're not the first existential threat humanity has faced, and they won't be the last. We've learned that survival isn't about being the strongest or the most advanced. It's about refusing to give up, even when every calculation says you should. The Vethkai arrived 37 hours after the human fleet completed its deployment. I watched from the Prometheus's observation deck as they emerged from the void, a swarm of dark shapes that seemed to drink in the light of stars. They were exactly as I remembered from every previous engagement, vast, incomprehensible, moving with a terrible purpose that required no communication or coordination. There were approximately 4,000 of them. Against the 23,000 human vessels now positioned throughout the system, they should have been outmatched. But I had watched Cathari fleets outnumber the Vethkai before. I had watched those fleets be consumed regardless. Admiral Chen stood beside me, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the enemy approach with an expression of calm focus. Around us, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, making final adjustments to battle plans, confirming coordination protocols, preparing for what would come. "Are you afraid, Admiral?" I asked. He considered the question seriously. Yes, any sane person would be afraid facing something like this. But fear isn't the same as doubt, Voice. I know my people. I know what they're capable of. And I know that whatever happens in the next few hours, we will make these things understand that humanity is not prey. The battle began not with a dramatic declaration, but with a simple command: all squadrons engage. What followed was unlike any military engagement I had ever witnessed. The human fleet did not move as a unified force. Instead, it fragmented into thousands of independent squadrons that flowed around and between the Vethkai like water around stones. They attacked from every direction simultaneously, never presenting a concentrated target, never allowing the Vethkai to focus their consuming attention on any single group. When a Vethkai turned to consume one squadron, 3 others would attack from behind. When it shifted to face those, the original squadron would reposition and strike from a new angle. The humans were not trying to destroy the Vethkai through superior firepower. They were trying to overwhelm them through constant, unrelenting pressure from all directions. And it was working. Slowly, impossibly, I began to see Vethkai falling. Their dark shapes shuddered under the coordinated assault, their consuming energies flickering and failing as human weapons found vulnerabilities that our own fleets had never had the coordination to exploit. "Admiral," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with controlled excitement, "Vethkai casualties are approaching 15%.
Our losses are at 3.7%. The strategy is working." Admiral Chen nodded, but did not allow himself to show satisfaction. "Maintain pressure. Don't let them adapt. Keep rotating squadrons to prevent exhaustion." Hours passed. The battle continued. Human squadrons rotated in and out of engagement, fresh crews replacing those who had been fighting, maintaining the constant pressure that prevented the Veth-Kai from regrouping or adapting. I watched in growing astonishment as the Veth-Kai, the unstoppable devourers that had consumed my civilization, began to fall in numbers that would have seemed impossible just days before. 20% casualties, 30%, 40%.
The Veth-Kai began to retreat.
I had never seen them retreat. In every engagement with Cathari forces, they had fought until either they were all destroyed or their opponents were consumed. Retreat was not in their behavioral patterns. Retreat implied the recognition of defeat, of opponents too dangerous to face.
But now they fled, the survivors breaking away from the engagement, accelerating toward the void between galaxies from which they had come. "Admiral," the tactical officer said, "the Veth-Kai are withdrawing. Should we pursue?" Admiral Chen shook his head.
"No. Let them go."
"Sir?" "Let them go," he repeated. "Let them carry the memory of this defeat back to whatever dark space they came from. Let them remember that they came to feed and found instead that some prey bites back." He turned to me, and I saw in his eyes not triumph, but something deeper, a weariness that spoke of centuries of human struggle. "We didn't come here to exterminate the Veth-Kai," voice Veleth sorned. "We came to save your people and show these things that there are consequences to threatening the species under our protection." "Under your protection?" I repeated. "Admiral, we never asked." "No, you didn't. But you called for help, and we answered. That means something to us. It means we've chosen to stand with you, regardless of the history between our peoples." He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of connection that I would have found presumptuous from almost anyone else. "The Cathari ascendancy dismissed humanity as irrelevant. You denied our requests for diplomatic recognition. You excluded us from every major galactic organization and made it clear that you considered us beneath your attention." "I know," I said quietly. "I know what we did. And yet we came anyway. Because we don't answer calls for help based on what the caller has done for us. We answer because someone needed help and we could provide it. That's the standard we've chosen to hold ourselves to, voice. Not, what have you done for us, but what do you need from us?" I looked out at the field of debris that marked where the Veth-Kai had fallen, where the unstoppable devourers had finally been stopped by a species that my civilization had dismissed as primitive and irrelevant. "Admiral, how long have you been preparing for something like this?" He smiled, and there was something in that expression that spoke of patience, of long-term thinking, of planning that stretched across generations. Since the moment we first detected evidence of civilizations beyond our own and realized that the galaxy was far more dangerous than we had imagined, we saw the Veth-Kai consuming distant systems decades before they reached Cathari space. We knew that eventually something like this would happen, either to us or to others. "And you built all of this in response? 23,000 ships? All the technology required to fight them?" "We built it because we knew that when the moment came, when someone sent a call into the void expecting no answer, we wanted to be ready to answer in force." He gestured at the fleet visible through the observation windows. "This is what humanity looks like when we're not holding back, voice. This is what we're capable of when we stop pretending to be less than we are and commit ourselves fully to a cause worth fighting for." "Why did you pretend? Why did you allow the galaxy to believe you were irrelevant? Because we'd learned from watching others. We watched ancient civilizations become targets because they revealed their strength too soon, before they were ready to defend it. We watched younger species be crushed because they drew attention before they could handle what that attention brought. So we chose to be overlooked. We chose to be dismissed. We built our strength in silence and waited for the moment when revealing it would matter.
And this is that moment?
This is one of them. Admiral Chen turned to face me fully. Voice Veleth Sorn, the galaxy is going to look very different after today. The Vethkai have been turned back for the first time in recorded history. The Cathari ascendancy has survived when everyone expected them to fall, and humanity has revealed capabilities that will force every power in the galaxy to reconsider their assumptions.
There will be fear, I said. Other civilizations will look at what you've demonstrated today and see not a savior, but a threat.
Yes, there will be fear. And that's where you come in, Voice. He smiled again. You're a diplomat, one of the best the Cathari ever produced from what I understand, despite being exiled to the margins for asking uncomfortable questions. Humanity is going to need advocates. People who can speak to what they witnessed today and help other civilizations understand what we truly are. And what are you truly, Admiral, in your own words? He considered the question carefully before answering. We are a species that has suffered, that has faced extinction more times than we can count, through our own foolishness, through natural disasters, through threats we created for ourselves. We have teetered on the brink of ending so many times that we've lost our fear of that brink. His voice dropped, becoming something closer to a confession. But we've also learned. Every time we nearly destroyed ourselves, we learned something. Every catastrophe taught us about resilience, about unity, about the importance of reaching out to others, even when reaching out is dangerous. He paused, looking out at the stars beyond the observation windows. Humanity is what you get when a species refuses to give up. When they keep standing up no matter how many times they're knocked down. When they take every failure and every loss and every moment of despair and use it as fuel to become something stronger. He met my gaze. We expected no answer when we faced our own darkest moments. The silence we received taught us the importance of answering when others call. That's the core of what humanity is, Voice Veleth Sorn. We are the answer that we wished we had received. In the weeks that followed, I served as the primary liaison between the surviving Cathari and the human forces that remained to help with reconstruction. I watched as human engineers worked alongside Cathari survivors to rebuild infrastructure. I observed human medical teams treating Cathari wounded with the same care they would have shown their own people. I saw human soldiers standing watch over refugee camps, protecting the remnants of a civilization that had once dismissed them as irrelevant. And I began to understand something that I had failed to grasp in 4 centuries of diplomatic service. The Cathari ascendancy had measured other species by their technology, their military power, their cultural achievements. We had dismissed humanity because they ranked low on every metric we considered important, but we had failed to measure the things that truly mattered: the strength of will, the capacity for empathy, the determination to answer when someone called for help. Humanity had built something greater than any fleet or technology. They had built a civilization that defined itself not by what it could take, but by what it would give. They had transformed their history of suffering into a commitment to prevent suffering in others. They had looked at the cold, uncaring void between stars and decided that they would fill that void with something warmer. They expected no answer. Humans answered in force.
Those words became my opening statement when I addressed the Galactic Assembly 3 months later, speaking as both a representative of the surviving Cathari and an advocate for humanity's full integration into galactic society. "We expected no answer," I said, my voice carrying across the vast chamber where representatives of 100 species had gathered. Our beacon faded into silence, and we prepared to die alone, forgotten, mourned by no one. We had earned that silence through millennia of arrogance and dismissal. We had treated other species as beneath our concern, and when we finally needed help, we received exactly what we had given to others.
I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But humanity answered. They answered not because we deserved it, not because we had earned it, not because they would gain anything from it. They answered because someone called for help, and they had decided, as a species, as a civilization, as a fundamental principle of their existence, that they would never ignore such a call.
The chamber was silent. Representatives who had spent their careers engaging in diplomatic maneuvering and careful positioning now sat motionless, confronted with something outside their experience. 23,000 ships, I continued. That is what humanity committed to saving the Cathari ascendancy. 23,000 ships, crewed by humans who knew they might not survive, who left families and homes behind to face an enemy that had never been defeated. They lost over 1,000 vessels. They lost over 40,000 people. They paid for our survival with their own blood, and when it was over, they stayed to help us rebuild.
I turned to look at the human delegation, Admiral Chen among them, sitting quietly in a uniform that bore no medals or decorations, his expression one of patient attentiveness.
We dismissed humanity as irrelevant. We denied them recognition. We excluded them from every significant organization and made it clear that we considered their entire species beneath serious attention. I felt the weight of centuries of diplomatic training pressing against the words I needed to say. We were wrong. We were catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Humanity is not irrelevant. Humanity is what this galaxy has needed for 12,000 years. A species that answers, regardless of the cost, regardless of the history, regardless of whether the caller deserves to be saved. They have shown us what strength truly looks like. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to save. Not the power to destroy, but the power to protect. I straightened, feeling something shift in my soul, a clarity that I had spent 4 centuries searching for without knowing it. I am here to advocate for humanity's full recognition and integration into galactic society. But more than that, I am here to suggest that perhaps we should be learning from them rather than the reverse. Perhaps the standard we should hold ourselves to is not "What have you done for us?" but "What do you need from us?" Perhaps the true measure of a civilization is not what it can take, but what it will give. I looked out at the assembled representatives, the ancient powers, the young civilizations, the species that had stood by and watched while the Cathari died. We expected no answer, and humanity answered in force. The question now is what we will do with the example they have given us. Will we continue to calculate advantage and measure obligation, helping only when it benefits us? Or will we learn from the humans and become something greater? A galaxy that answers, not because we must, but because someone called and we could help. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Admiral Chen rose from his seat in the human delegation. He did not speak, simply stood, hands clasped behind his back, meeting my gaze with a slight nod of acknowledgement.
And around the chamber, one by one, other representatives began to stand as well. Not all of them, perhaps not even most of them, but enough to show that something had shifted, that the example humanity had set was beginning to take root. When I returned to Earth 6 months later for the formal establishment of diplomatic relations between the Cathari survivors and the United Earth Defense Coalition, I asked Admiral Chen one final question. When you first detected our beacon, before you began mobilizing your fleet, did you ever consider not responding? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window of his office at the blue-green world that had given birth to his species. I considered it, he admitted, for about 30 seconds. Then I remembered every time in human history when someone called for help and no one came. I remembered the genocides that could have been stopped, the famines that could have been prevented, the disasters that could have been mitigated if only someone had answered. I remembered the silence that we received in our own darkest moments. He turned to face me. And I decided that whatever the Cathari had done, whatever history lay between us, I would not add another silence to the universe. I would not be the one who chose not to answer when someone needed help. Even knowing the cost? The ships lost? The lives lost? Voice Veleth Sorn, every person in that fleet volunteered, knowing they might not return. We explained the risks. We showed them the recordings of Vethkai consuming entire worlds, and they volunteered anyway, because they understood something that I think the rest of the galaxy is only beginning to grasp. He smiled, and in that expression I saw the full weight of human history, the suffering, the survival, the determination that had forged them into something unprecedented. They understood that some things are worth dying for, and saving 47,000 people, being the answer when no one expected one, that was worth it. I bowed then, in the formal manner of Cathari diplomatic protocol, the deepest bow, reserved only for those who had earned profound respect. Admiral Chen, on behalf of the Cathari people, on behalf of everyone who survived because you chose to answer, I offer our gratitude, not because protocol demands it, but because you have taught us something we should have learned millennia ago, something about what it means to be worthy of survival. He returned the bow, awkward in human fashion, but sincere in its intent. We're all still learning, Voice. Humanity doesn't have all the answers. We've made more mistakes than we can count, and we'll make more before we're done. But we've learned this much. The universe is cold and vast and often cruel, and the only warmth in it is what we create through our choices. We chose to answer your call. We'll keep choosing to answer, whenever we can, for as long as we exist. He extended his hand, a human gesture of alliance that I had studied but never performed. Welcome to the family, Voice Veleth Sorn. Welcome to the species that answers. I took his hand, feeling the warmth of it, the strength and the gentleness combined. And in that moment, I understood finally why humanity had come. Not because we deserved it, not because they would gain from it, not because history or obligation or strategic calculation demanded it. They came because they had learned, through centuries of suffering and struggle and loss, that the answer to desperation is not calculation, but compassion, that the response to a cry for help is not evaluation, but action, that the silence of the universe is not a fact to be accepted, but a wrong to be corrected, one answered call at a time. We expected no answer. Humanity answered in force, and the galaxy was never the same.